The wooden pulpit trembled beneath Pastor Marcus Whitfield's clenched fists as his voice thundered through Cornerstone Baptist Church. "The Catholics worship graven images," he declared, his steel-gray eyes blazing with righteous fury. "They bow before statues of dead saints and pray to a woman instead of Christ himself." The congregation of 200 faithful nodded in solemn agreement, their faces reflecting the same fervor that had burned in Marcus's heart for 23 years of ministry. But today, something felt different. A cold knot of dread twisted in his stomach as his phone vibrated against his chest. "They call her the Queen of Heaven," Marcus continued, his voice cracking slightly. "But Scripture says there is one mediator between God and man, and that mediator is Jesus Christ, not some statue of Mary." The phone buzzed again, more insistently. Marcus tried to ignore it, but Elena's ringtone cut through his concentration like a knife. His wife never called during service unless something was terribly wrong. Marcus fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as Elena's panicked voice pierced through the sanctuary's holy silence. "Marcus, you need to come now. Maria's been in an accident. They don't think she's going to make it." The words hit him like a physical blow. His 20-year-old daughter, his only child, the girl who had broken his heart by converting to Catholicism during college. The congregation watched in stunned silence as their usually composed pastor gripped the pulpit for support. "I have to go," he whispered into the microphone. Then louder, "Please pray for my family." The drive to St. Catherine's Hospital felt like an eternity. Of course it would be the Catholic hospital, Marcus thought bitterly. Even in crisis, God seemed to be testing his resolve against the very faith he had spent decades condemning. Elena met him at the emergency room entrance, her face streaked with tears and clutching something in her trembling hands. A rosary. Marcus's jaw tightened at the sight of the beaded chain. The intensive care unit corridor reeked of antiseptic and desperation. Marcus's eyes swept over the walls adorned with crucifixes and portraits of saints, his stomach churning with each religious image that seemed to mock his presence. A statue of the Virgin Mary stood sentinel near the nurse's station, her serene face turned toward the family waiting area. "She's unconscious," Elena whispered, her voice hollow. "Multiple head injuries from the car crash. The doctors are running more tests, but Marcus..." She broke down completely, the rosary slipping through her fingers to clatter on the linoleum floor. Father Antonio Santos approached them with gentle steps, his clerical collar catching the fluorescent light. "I'm the hospital chaplain. I wanted to offer my prayers for your daughter." Marcus stiffened, every muscle in his body coiling like a spring. "We don't need Catholic prayers," he said curtly. "My God hears me just fine without your intercession." The priest's kind eyes never wavered. "Of course. I simply meant to offer comfort during this difficult time." Dr. Rebecca Chun emerged from Maria's room with the expression Marcus had learned to dread over the past 18 hours. Her surgical scrubs were wrinkled, her dark eyes heavy with exhaustion and something worse than fatigue. "The swelling in her brain isn't responding to treatment," she said quietly. "We've tried everything conventional medicine has to offer. Her condition is deteriorating rapidly." Elena grabbed Marcus's arm, her fingernails digging into his flesh. "There has to be something else. Some experimental treatment, another specialist, anything." Dr. Chin shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry. At this point, we're looking at hours, not days. You should prepare yourselves and gather any family who wants to say goodbye." The words struck Marcus like lightning. His knees buckled, and he found himself gripping the wall for support, his eyes inadvertently falling on the Virgin Mary statue. For a split second, her carved face seemed to shimmer with compassion, but he quickly looked away, his jaw hardening with renewed defiance. The hospital chapel stood empty except for Marcus, who knelt reluctantly in the back pew as midnight approached. Elena had begged him to pray, anywhere, with anyone who would listen. His congregation had gathered in their own sanctuary miles away, but somehow their distant prayers felt inadequate against the weight of impending loss. The chapel's stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the altar, where an ornate statue of Mary dominated the sacred space. Her hands were outstretched in welcome, her eyes downcast in maternal sorrow. Marcus forced himself to look away, focusing instead on the simple wooden cross mounted on the sidewall. "God, I don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking in the silence. "I've served you faithfully for over 2 decades. I've preached your word, led souls to salvation. Why are you taking my daughter?" The statue seemed to glow in his peripheral vision, but Marcus stubbornly kept his eyes fixed on the cross, his hands clenched in desperate prayer as tears finally began to fall. The air in the chapel suddenly grew thick and warm, like being embraced by invisible arms. Marcus felt the hair on his neck rise as an inexplicable peace settled over his shoulders. He tried to dismiss it as emotional exhaustion, but then the scent hit him, roses in full bloom, impossibly sweet and fresh in the sterile hospital environment. Against every instinct, his eyes drifted to the Mary statue. Her marble face seemed softer somehow, more alive than carved stone should ever appear. A gentle light emanated from around her figure, not the harsh fluorescent glow from above, but something warmer, more golden. "This is not real," Marcus whispered through gritted teeth. "Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. I will not be deceived." But even as he spoke the words, his heart betrayed him. The crushing weight of grief that had pressed down on him for hours began to lift. The statue's outstretched hands seemed to beckon him forward, offering comfort he had never known he needed until this moment of absolute desperation. Marcus stumbled from the chapel, his mind reeling from the encounter he couldn't explain or dismiss. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before him, but a figure near Maria's room made him stop short. A woman in simple blue clothing stood beside Elena, her hand resting gently on his wife's shoulder. "Who is that?" Marcus asked the passing nurse. "Who is who, sir?" The nurse followed his gaze to where Elena sat alone, clutching Maria's rosary bracelet. Marcus blinked hard. The woman had vanished. Elena looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, holding out the delicate silver chain adorned with tiny beads and a small crucifix. "She left this for you," Elena whispered. "Maria always wore it. She said it brought her peace." Every fiber of Marcus's Baptist training screamed against touching the Catholic symbol. Yet as his trembling fingers closed around the warm metal, an inexplicable calm flooded through him. The beads seemed to pulse with gentle energy, and for the first time in hours, hope flickered in his heart. Marcus sat beside Maria's bed, the rosary bracelet wrapped around his wrist as he studied his daughter's pale face. The mechanical rhythm of the ventilator had become his prayer cadence, each breath a desperate plea to heaven. Elena had fallen asleep in the corner chair, exhausted from 2 days of vigil. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "All these years, I taught that Mary was just another human being, but..." He touched the tiny silver crucifix on the bracelet. "You loved her, didn't you? Not as a goddess, but as a mother who understood suffering." The memory of his own mother's death when he was 12 flooded back unbidden. She had been Catholic before marrying his Baptist father, but she'd converted and never spoke of her childhood faith. In that moment, Marcus realized his anger had never been about theology, it had been about abandonment, about losing the one woman who had loved him unconditionally. As tears fell onto Maria's hand, the heart monitor's steady beat began to change rhythm. Dr. Chen rushed into the room as alarms began sounding, but they weren't the dreaded flatline warnings Marcus had been fearing. Elena jerked awake as nurses flooded in, their faces reflecting confusion rather than panic. The brain pressure monitor showed numbers that shouldn't have been possible. "This doesn't make medical sense," Dr. Chen whispered, studying the readings. "Her intracranial pressure has dropped to normal levels. The swelling is receding rapidly." Father Antonio appeared in the doorway with members of both congregations, Marcus's Baptist faithful and the local Catholic parish. They had come together to pray, setting aside decades of denominational division in the face of a child's suffering. Holy Mary, Mother of God, Father Antonio began softly. Pray for us sinners. Marcus found himself completing, the ancient words flowing from lips that had never spoken them before. Elena stared at him in amazement as their daughter's eyelids began to flutter. Maria's eyes opened slowly, focusing first on her father's face, then on the rosary bracelet wrapped around his wrist. A peaceful smile crossed her lips. 3 days later, Marcus stood before the largest gathering Cornerstone Baptist Church had ever seen. Catholics and Protestants filled every pew, spilling into the aisles and doorways. His hands trembled as he gripped the same pulpit where he had condemned their faith just a week before. I owe you all an apology, he began, his voice thick with emotion. For 23 years, I preached division instead of love. I called your devotion to Mary idolatry because I was afraid of losing control, afraid of admitting I might be wrong. Father Antonio sat in the front row beside Elena and Maria, who still wore her rosary bracelet. The young woman squeezed her father's hand encouragingly. The Virgin Mary didn't threaten my faith, Marcus continued, tears streaming down his face. She saved it. She saved my daughter when I was too proud to ask for help. She showed me that a mother's love doesn't compete with Christ's love, it reflects it. The congregation sat in stunned silence as their pastor's transformation became undeniably real. 6 months later, the town's first joint Thanksgiving service filled St. Catherine's Gymnasium, with Protestant and Catholic families sharing tables that had never been set together before. Marcus watched in wonder as his congregation members laughed with their Catholic neighbors, children playing together while their parents discovered decades of unnecessary division. You've started something beautiful here, Father Antonio said, approaching Marcus with a warm smile. The seminary has asked me to recommend you for their interfaith dialogue program. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. His theological studies had taken an unexpected turn, diving deep into Marian devotion and early church history. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about Catholic worship, revealing layers of biblical foundation he had never considered. Elena appeared at his side, carrying their first grandchild, Maria's newborn son, named Gabriel in honor of the angel who first announced Christ coming to Mary. The baby wore a tiny bracelet identical to his mother's rosary, a symbol of faith passed down through generations of women who understood suffering and hope. 2 years have passed since that night in the hospital chapel, and Marcus still keeps Maria's rosary bracelet in his pocket during every sermon. His ministry has transformed from tearing down walls to building bridges, leading interfaith retreats across 3 states where former enemies now call each other family. I used to think faith was about being right, Marcus told the packed auditorium at the regional pastors' conference. But the Virgin Mary taught me that faith is about being open to God's love, even when it comes in ways we never expected. Dr. Chin still calls Maria's recovery medically impossible. The brain scans from that night remain in her files as evidence of something beyond medical explanation. Maria now works as a hospital chaplain herself, carrying rosary bracelets for families facing their own impossible situations. Elena watches from the front row as Marcus concludes his testimony, their grandson, Gabriel, sleeping peacefully in her arms. The baby's tiny fingers curl around the same silver crucifix that once terrified his grandfather, but now represents the mystery of divine love working through surrendered hearts. Have you ever witnessed something that science couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below and let us know if you've experienced moments where the impossible became possible.